On this, the 103rd episode of What the Ship, we talk about the top 5 maritime stories as of May 15th, 2024. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. We're back. It's been a while since we've been able to do What the Ship. It has been crazy busy here at what's going on with shipping. It's so hard to keep up with everything that is happening in and around the maritime sector. Been doing a lot of small stories, a lot of focus on big news items, but today we're going to get granular. We're going to get down in the details. We're going to talk about some specific elements of global shipping. Yeah, we're going to talk about containers. We're going to talk about tankers. We're going to talk about some international aspects. We're going to go all around the globe and cover everything you need to know about global shipping. Hey, if you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, let's go ahead and jump to story number 1. So our first story is going to take us around the world. We're going to look at some hot stories from different areas around the globe that are impacting shipping. So one of the biggest has to do with what are called ship-to-ship transfers. This is where oil tankers meet other oil tankers out at sea and transfer cargo between the two vessels. In this case, this story takes us to Malaysia, where the U.S. is flagging some environmental risks from the movement of cargo off Iranian tankers and Iranian oil off the coast of Malaysia. Specifically, the U.S. Treasury is warning of these risks. Now, we did a story early on about a tanker called the Pablo that suffered a catastrophic explosion due to the lack of its inert gas system working. Now, this has been a major issue. We've seen the development of what is sometimes referred to as the dark fleet or the shadow fleet or the gray fleet, but what we are seeing is the establishment of a parallel fleet that's operating under these open registries, not the normal ones, not Liberia, Panama, the Marshall Islands, but nations like Gabon and a few others that are really not doing the inspections they need to. They're getting insurance from beyond the normal 12 international P&I clubs, and they're not coming in and out of port so they can be inspected. And here the U.S. is flagging the environmental risk, but in truth, what they're doing is flagging Iranian oil. Next, the Panama Canal is in talks with U.S. LNG, this is liquefied natural gas producers, to increase transits through the canal. So one of the things we've seen is low water in the Panama Canal has cut by a third the number of transits going through the canal. And that meant a lot of U.S. liquefied natural gas was not heading through the Panama Canal to Asia, where the 3 largest consumers of U.S. LNG, South Korea, Japan, and China are. Instead, they've been heading over to Europe. And now Panama Canal is trying to get them back. Why? Because we've had rain in the Panama Canal. We finally see it. This shows you historically the water levels for the Panama Canal. And in May, we're usually at the lowest point, 82.5 feet. And what we see is that gradual climb. Well, if you look at the numbers here, we are seeing that happen. Now, we're way below where they should be, only sitting at 80.5 feet, but hopefully by July, based on rain forecasts, the canal should be raising back up 82 feet. It needs to continue on this track, and hopefully if this track continues, we'll see a resumption of canal transits. The new president-elect of Panama has announced that one of his priority missions is to correct the water management issues in and around Gatun Lake and the Panama Canal. Remember, it's a freshwater canal, the Panama Canal. It needs Gatun Lake to be at full levels. This means more water reclamation and a better job in catching water that's coming out of the canal. Next, we head over to Peru, where there's an dispute escalating between COSCO, the Chinese overseas shipping company, and Peru. China is trying to create a huge megaport in a place called Shanghai. Shanghai, where this port terminal is going to be a big hub on the Peru coast for a megaport. The west coast of South America is seen as a new potential expansion point. It would be on the west side or the southern side of the Panama Canal on the Pacific side, and it can serve as a transit hub for cargo that are going up and down the west coast of South America and then through the Drake Passage over to the east coast of South America or potentially over to Asia. And China is right now is in a big kind of issue with Peru over this about going back to the original agreements as was negotiated. We just seen a worker, Chinese worker, die in the port. China has consistently throughout the world been constructing a lot of infrastructure and to very beneficial terms for them. But here, Peru is fighting some of those issues and wanting to see a change in the original agreement. Next, Australia is announcing a ban on the export by sea of live sheep starting in May of 2028. Now, I've come out and said I'm not a big fan of livestock shipments. Let me be clear. There are some horrendous stories about livestock shipment going on. At the same time, there are good shipments of livestock that are there. And I got to be careful about this. There are companies that are extremely thoughtful and do a great job in shipping livestock. The problem is there's a lot that aren't. And this is not a trade that gets a lot of attention. And you may be sitting there going, why are we even shipping livestock overseas? Some countries will not accept animals unless they're alive. In other words, you can't slaughter them and just ship the meat over. You have to ship the animals in their entirety. And Australia is coming out now with this export. Now, what's interesting about this export, it's 4 years from now. And the question is, why is it taking so long for it to take place? And second, what's going to be that impact in Australia of ranchers who are raising sheep that all of a sudden their export is going to be cut off? This is a very delicate subject to talk about, but I think it is one that needs to be talked about. We can improve how we move livestock on ships. The problem is many of the ships that do this are in open registries without a lot of protections and a lot of checks on them. And so perhaps this could be an opportunity for Australia to introduce some livestock exporting vessels that meet certain criteria and therefore continue with the practice. Next, Maersk is questioning their rival's solvency in a battle over South Africa's Durban's container port. Because of the Houthi attacks on shipping, Durban in South Africa, the container port there, has gotten a lot more attention than ever before. It is becoming a major hub for transshipment. And Maersk, which is in a bid to take over part of the Durban container port, is really kind of questioning their rival's ability to run that port. Maersk obviously wants the port. They want to be able to get in there to get a big foothold. This is geopolitical. If they can get in there, they can operate a potential mega port, much like COSCO is doing in Peru. And so Maersk is really doing all they can to raise this concern. I think South Africa right now is becoming a major focus for global shipping. India inks a 10-year deal to operate Iran's Chabahar port. So India just signed this 10-year deal to operate this port for the nation. Now, India has been wanting to get larger and larger ports. They are really sandwiched between some big rivals. You have Sri Lanka down at Colombo. You have a large container facilities in the United Arab Emirates and Oman, for example. There's talk of Indonesia developing a large one in northern Sumatra. You have it Singapore. But India itself does not have any major large ports. And so for the potential here for India to get into operating the port of Chabahar for Iran is an interesting one. Plus, India has been in a bit of an issue with Iran because of attacks on shipping in the northern Arabian Sea and off the coast of India. And so obviously the Indians have a big problem with the Houthi, who are forcing cargo ships destined to and from India to divert around Africa. This is a really long transit if you're going from India to Europe to go around Africa. So again, a very interesting geopolitical move. And then the last one here is the issue about flooding hitting Brazil's grain ports. And Brazil is a massive exporter of soy, rice, wheat, and meat. And when you look at the flooding here, this is the aerial image here from Porto Alegre in Brazil. It gives you the idea of what is happening there. Brazil, Argentina, we've seen this in South America, going between drought and way too much water. This impacts the ability of these countries to export grain. A major impact is happening here. So real quick, around the world gives you an idea of some of the maritime issues that are going on in very unique countries around the world and how they can impact you, the consumer, the shipper, moving cargo around the world. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 2. Story number 2 deals with the tanker sector, and holy cow, are tankers on fire. I don't mean literally on fire. We have those stories sometimes, but I mean the stocks are on fire. And if we're talking about stocks, the person we want to go to is our buddy Greg Miller. Greg Miller, now over at Lloyd's List, has this story, which is a catch-all story, I'll admit. It covers all the sectors, but we're going to look at containers here in a second. As shipping stocks soar, controlling shareholders reap the rewards. Tanker, container, and dry bulk stocks simultaneously hit 52-week highs. Greg, as Greg always does, gives you the detail. This story is outside the paywall of Lloyd, so really recommend it. And when you look at the details, you'll understand what Greg is talking about. Let's take a look at tanker stocks versus the S&P 5-year average. So these are the major tanker players that we see out there. This goes all the way back to 2019. We set it at 0 based on the S&P 500. And what you see is just the takeoff of tanker stocks. So if you got into TORM or TK or Frontline or INSW or OSG, Overseas Shipping Group, which is a US company, you see how much you've been doing. Tankers have been doing well. Now, wasn't doing great there during the supply chain crisis, particularly when everybody wasn't driving. We saw tankers hit that negative, but now we see tankers really just reaping that benefits. And this past week has been an absolute boon in the tanker sector. We're going to talk about containers in our next story here, but if you look at container stocks there, you can see the benefits that have been there. Danos, Global Ship Lease, Zim, and Matson. Zim in particularly has been on a wild ride this past week with breaking just huge numbers, over $19 a share in their stocks. Head over here to the dry bulk sector and you see Starbulk, Golden Ocean, Genco, all having these really peak periods right now. And if you look in the LPG sector, liquefied petroleum gas, you see Dorian just booming away. Now, unfortunately, one of the things we've seen is a lot of companies have backed away from stocks, container companies in particularly, but tanker companies are one of the few where you can invest in. And let's take a look a little bit further here at the tanker sector. So this story from TradeWinds, this is also outside their pay window, so you can go ahead and take a look at it. John Fredriksen, tanker market beginning multi-year recovery. And so one of the things we've been waiting for is tankers to rebound. We've seen tankers really do pitiful since the mid-aughts. It has not been good in the tanker market, but as John Fredriksen here, who is a legend in the tanker industry, is talking about here, we're about to see this recovery take place. And one of the reasons for this recovery is, one, we don't have a lot of tanker tonnage out there. Because the tanker companies haven't been making huge profits, they haven't been building new tankers. So there's a finite number of tankers out there. The routes are now elongated due to the Houthi, and some other issues have made routes much longer. That means that the tankers have to sail longer, more ton miles, and that makes their value more important, and it's going up. And this is causing stock prices to increase. Another story here by Greg Miller. Product tanker owners savor that heady mix of geopolitics, strong demand, and shrinking debt. And here Greg really breaks down that tanker elements that we saw in the initial story there, why we're seeing those tanker companies just doing fantastic right now. At the same time, Michelle Weiss-Bachmann over at Lloyd's, tanker shipping Russian oil defy regulators as UK sanctioned shipping companies disband. So we're seeing a lot of sanctions being leveled by the United States and the United Kingdom, the G7, EU, against Russian oil companies. And those companies are disbanding. However, they're kind of popping up in new places under new company names in outside nations, the UAE, India, across Asia. So it becomes kind of a whack-a-mole here. This is the issue I talked about in a previous video where I talked about why the dark fleet, or this parallel fleet, is becoming such a bane for the world shipping economy. Same thing story here from Bloomberg, how Western sanctions are strangling Putin's Arctic gas ambitions. The Arctic is one of the areas that Putin doesn't have a lot of flexibility in as much as exporting diesel and oil. Because of the export of LNG, liquefied natural gas, this is a much easier sector for the US, G7, and EU to sanction. But we're seeing those pop-up Russian oil traders come up. And again, what you're seeing is the US and other countries are trying to go after them with sanctions, but it's really difficult as they pop up in these other countries. So that makes the tanker market one of the most dynamic right now we're seeing. It's been really incredible. A lot of people I know have been talking about the tanker renaissance happening. And this is exactly what we're seeing taking place right now. If you remember back in 2020 when we had the supply chain crisis, it was the container sector, it was the leasers, it was the operators, all of them boomed up. Saw the same thing recently with cruise lines having their rebound come up. Well, it's tankers right now, and tankers is the market to be watching. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to containers in story number 3. Our next story, we go over to the container sector, where we're going to talk about a tale of two cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And to quote Dickens, and actually maybe a little bit of Shakespeare, I smell something fishy in Denmark. We're going to go look at our favorite container liner in the world, Maersk Lines, and see what they have going on, because what they're saying and what's actually happening seems to be two different things. So here's a story from Maersk back in February. Maersk shares hammered as Red Sea boosts mass overcapacity. So you may remember there was a story being put out by the container companies talking about the issue about the diversion around, and that the diversions weren't going to cause a big issue with the Houthis because they had so much overcapacity. They had so much extra tonnage. Story from May 2nd. Maersk raises financial forecast for 2024 amid strong market demand Red Sea disruptions. Maersk has revised its financial guidance after an extremely strong Q1 from a EBIT of negative 2 billion to 0 billion. In other words, marking basically a wash here. But that's a $2 billion swing, indicating that there's something afoot here going on. Maersk says Red Sea disruption could cut Asia to Europe capacity by 20%. But hang on a second. I thought we were told we have a lot of overcapacity. How is it that we're having all this new tonnage come online, yet we're seeing a reduction? I know we're sailing longer to go around Africa, but I don't understand what's happening. Then you see this. Maersk continues to reroute ships indefinitely as Houthis threaten escalation. One of the things that we're seeing right now, based on the latest numbers, is that we're seeing 2/3 of the number of ships traditionally going through the Bab el-Mandab, everybody take a moment, is down. But more importantly, tonnage is down by 3/4, 75%. So 2/3 less ships going through, 3/4 less cargo going through. That means ships are being diverted. But again, I thought we had extra capacity coming on in the container sector. What's going on here? Well, what we're seeing is unabated Red Sea crisis propelling a new surge in global container rates. This is by Chechen Shen over at Lloyd's, and across the board rate increase on almost all trade highlights the spillover effect caused by the Red Sea crisis. And what we're seeing is the carriers are controlling the market as spot rates rise and capacity tightens. We're seeing a lot of blank sailings. In other words, the carriers are canceling sailings. They're controlling the amount of containers that are being moved. This is from Gavin Van Marl over at Lodestar. You can take away all sense and rationale, and whatever is left is the container shipping market. That's Peter Sands over at Zentia talking about it. It's been a crazy early month here in looking at the container market. And if you look at Drewry's world index and then specific rates, you're seeing that kickback in rates. We saw the rates hit this high way back in January 25th. We had this huge peak here. Then it just dropped off, and then we thought it was going to stabilize here, but now it's kicking back up again. And it's same on all the routes. It's the Shanghai to Rotterdam, Shanghai to Los Angeles, Shanghai to Genoa, Shanghai to New York. All of them are seeing massive upticks. And one of the reasons we're seeing that, number one, Asian ports are hit by Red Sea backlogs because this has thrown off the amount of ships coming in and the normal schedules. There is a lot of backlog going on in Asian ports. They're just hammered trying to get caught up by the initial diversions and the waves. Whenever you throw a system into a rear, you're going to get these impacts. And we're seeing that in Asia. At the same time, you're seeing the market panic. It's triggering this sharp rate surge because now we're coming into May, into the summer season. This is when a lot of cargo starts flowing across, getting ready for, believe it or not, the end of the year sales. You've got to be getting your seasonal goods going. And because of disruptions, now people are ordering sooner rather than later. Add to it, even though we're getting record container ship capacity delivered in 2024, the longer voyages, and remember, it's not just longer voyages, but ships have to slow down because of environmental issues with carbon release. They have to slow down, so you're not getting the exact change that you were hoping for here, even though we're having over 1 million TEUs of capacity coming online. And one of the reasons is we're seeing an uptick in U.S. container imports during this period. Descartes came out with their most recent numbers for March, and we're seeing volumes rise by 3%. It's up 9.3% year on year. So when you look at March of 2024, where in the past, for example, back in 2019 and 2020, you saw a decrease, we are following the line for 2021, 2022, and 2023 with a slight increase. Now, it's not the same amount of increase, but it's staying very stable. And what you can expect to see is that increase continue here into this void area. So we're really charting a new path here as these containers are coming online. And you really come to the end here with a piece by Lorianne Larocco over at FreightWaves. Ocean carrier cocktail is leaving a sour taste in shippers' mouths as the carriers hope to protect against rate erosions. What is happening here, and Lorianne's piece, probably the best one to encapsulate all this, because it's going to increase freight rates. Then they saw those rates begin to fall off a cliff. And what they've done now is you've slowed ships down to reduce emissions because of taxes and IMO requirements. You've also seen the backlog in the ports in both Asia, the United States, and Europe, and now demand is upticked a little bit because the economy is up a little bit. That is causing this disruption. And so off the bat here, where we thought containers were on the downhill track, now all of a sudden they're kicking back up. It is a crazy roller coaster in both tankers and containers right now. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to our next story. So our next story takes us around the world again, but this time we're looking at naval and maritime events that are impacting global shipping. And one of my favorite authors, Bruce Jones's To Rule the Waves, is a great book which kind of discusses the elements here about the return of great power competition to the high seas. One of the things that has made ocean shipping fantastic since World War II was the fact that there have been no major threats to ocean shipping on the high seas, which allows companies to basically reflag their ships to these open registries, to lower the cost of transportation through the use of crews from countries from around the world where they could pay low wages, but also because they don't have to pay for protection for them. Plus new technologies, the growth of ships, containerization, all those things have basically made shipping costs on the world's ocean go down. But now we're seeing a series of confrontations that are once again challenging the free movement of ships around the world. And to give you a taste for that, let's go around the world. So first, we get this from the shipping industry with a plea to the United Nations to protect maritime security and seafarers. A global shipping industry sent an urgent joint letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations. This deals not just with the capture of the MSC Ares by Iran in the Straits of Hormuz, but by issues of Somali piracy, of the Houthi, of attacks in and around the Black Sea. You name it. There is a increased threat to merchant mariners on the high seas. And so here you have 16 different maritime associations and partners calling for assistance in this protection. Add for it, we're seeing naval exercises taking place. For example, Greece staged a large naval exercise in its waters, and what that is doing is pushing Russian ship-to-ship transfers out further into the Mediterranean. Greece is basically exerting its influence in and around its waters. Now, Greece has a very interesting agreement under UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, where some of its territorial waters only reach out 6 miles vice 12 miles. This has to do with competition, or excuse me, conflicting claims between Greece and Turkey. But Laconian Gulf has been an area that where Russians have been doing ship-to-ship transfers right within sight of land of Greece. And the Greeks are using a naval exercise to kind of push them further out to sea. They're doing that for obvious reasons. They don't want ship-to-ship transfers taken close off their shores, but it's also exposing the rest of the Mediterranean to some risk here. The Philippines are in a fight, almost a full conflict war in some ways, with China over some islands in and around the South China Sea. The Chinese Coast Guard, which is not a Coast Guard, it is basically a thug organization that has been attacking Philippine vessels with water cannons. We're seeing this fight between these two sides, and both Philippines and China are trying to exert territorial claim over islands. There's a report just out that the Chinese may be developing a new island in the South China Sea. And then you have the Houthi. Houthi and Iran are doing more in the central region of Europe, Africa, and Asia than any other nation right now. So here we have this Houthi claim that they're conducting operations in the Indian Ocean. And we just had the European Union come out with issues about extended piracy concerns. There was just a thwarted attack on a vessel that was prevented by the onboard maritime security team, but assisted by a Spanish frigate as part of an anti-piracy operation done by the European naval forces. And the EU NAVFOR has put out a recommendation on where vessels should sail to escape attacks by both Somali pirates and Houthi extended missile attacks out into this region. And what we're seeing is a larger and larger area that is being targeted for attack by both the Houthi and Somalis. We even have the Houthi threatening attacks in the Mediterranean. We think this is linked to the Gaza pier that the United States, along with the United Kingdom, are putting together to get aid into the region. And then you have this, the Iranian have sent one of their warships. This is their modified container ship, what they call an aircraft carrier. It's really a drone carrier. The Shahid Mahdavi was sent out into the Indian Ocean. From the deck of this vessel, they can launch not just drones, but also anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles. They are out there now posing another threat that had not been seen before. So all of this equates to potential threats to commercial shipping on the high seas. And the question is, should navies go out and defend them? The problem is many of the ships that are flying or are sailing through this area are flying flags from nations like Liberia, the Marshall Islands, Panama, which don't have navies. It's one of the benefits of global shipping has been is you don't need a navy because there's no threats on the high seas. Well, guess what? There are threats on the high seas. We are seeing a reduction through the Bab el-Mandab of 2/3 the number of ships sailing through, 3/4 of the amount of tonnage going through. That is forcing shipping around Africa. This is exposing shipping to attacks, to greater threat, to higher rates, as we saw in the tanker and container markets. All of this is having an impact. And the question becomes is what do you do to neutralize a force like the Houthi? Remember, the Houthi are doing their attacks, they say, because they're doing it in solidarity with Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza. However, the Houthi are attacking ships that have nothing to do with Israel, the UK, and the British in many cases. Yes, they have attacked vessels that have connections, but they've also attacked vessels that have no connection, mainly because the Houthi don't know what ships they're attacking. And that's not the Houthis' fault either, by the way. It's international shipping. It's really hard to friggin' tell who owns a ship these days because it's so clouded. And so you can't be surprised when this happens. But you know how you fix that? You fly a flag from a country that has a navy. The US, the UK, Japan, Korea, any of the major powers. But the problem is even the United States is not doing a great job in defending its own ships through the region. We saw the attacks on Maersk Yorktown, which was defended by several American destroyers. But prior to that, we had several American ships turn around and not sail through the region. That is a clear indication to the Houthi that they are winning this fight. And again, what needs to be done is more than just bombing Yemen, because the Saudis did that for 10 years. You need to undercut the Houthis in their ability to support this action. And the way you do it is either you eliminate the issue that's getting them to do this. This would be pressure against Israel in Gaza, or you cut the flow of munitions to the Houthi that can be used to target these vessels, or you set up convoys where you run high-value ships through the region. Again, what the U.S. and the U.K. under Operation Prosperity Guardian were doing initially was protecting every ship. And you can't protect everything. You protect everything, you protect nothing. And the detriment there was U.S. and Western nations, and along with some Asian allied nations, were not being protected. And this meant now that they have to go that long way around. This is impacting everything we just talked about before in the container and the tanker sector. All right, let's go to our last story. For our last story, we're going to look at shipbuilding. Now, I just did a whole video on global shipbuilding in the commercial sector based on BRS shipbrokers. Take a look at that video. It really breaks down where shipbuilding is. Well, spoiler alert, it's in China, Japan, and Korea, with China in the lead, then South Korea, then Japan, then the rest of the world. But we're talking about nearly 95% of almost all shipbuilding is done in those three countries, with China having over 50% of ships under new orders. Well, we're seeing that surge in shipbuilding hit right now. Shipyard output hits a 7-year high with new ships entering out into the marketplace. This has caused some backlash, particularly within the United States. The Biden administration has launched a probe into China's unfair shipbuilding practices. This is as a result of an investigation launched by the U.S. Trade Representative looking at how China builds ships. Understand, the reason China is the major shipbuilder in the world today is because they use both direct and indirect subsidies. What do I mean? Direct subsidies are cash given to shipbuilders. Here's money. This is going to help lower the cost to build a ship. But then there are indirect subsidies. This is cheap land, cheap labor, cheap resources, cheap capital, low safety measures, less government intrusion. All of this has helped propel China to be the #1 shipbuilder. And understand, post-World War II, we saw this done in other areas. In Europe and Japan, this is what allowed them to surge to the top of shipbuilding in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Then in the 80s, we saw South Korea do it. Now in the 2000s, we see China do it. So this has been done repeatedly. And one of the big issues for the United States is the U.S. has not kept up because it basically ended any sort of shipbuilding subsidies in the 1980s, and it never fully embraced what other countries were doing to really encourage shipbuilding in their countries. Yes, I know some people are going to sit there and say the Jones Act is the reason the U.S. is where it is today, but in truth, it's not the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, the Jones Act. It's the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which did the construction and operational differential subsidies, which were ended in the 1980s, that got us to where we are. But the other element is just, in some cases, poor shipbuilding practices in the United States. Because of the fact we don't build a lot of commercial ships, we rely on government ships. And that can be seen in the next issue coming toward U.S. shipbuilding, which is the Coast Guard and their icebreakers. The Coast Guard is to start cutter construction before finalizing design, despite recommendations. All right. The GAO, the Government Accounting Office, just released a report that said that if you're going to build ships, it's a good idea to have the plans in place before you start building them. This is like building a car without having the plans for, I don't know, the engine. So you build a car and then like, okay, now we got to put this engine in it. That's going to be a tough fit. It's like building a 2-story house without having the plans for the first story. You just don't do it. Yet in the United States, in shipbuilding, especially for the government, they do this all the freaking time. It makes no sense. And right now we're seeing the same thing happen regard to the Coast Guard and their shipbuilding program. So the U.S. Coast Guard polar security cutter is facing substantial cost overruns and delays until 2029. Gee, I can't figure out why. Maybe it's because you're trying to build a ship without a plan in hand. How can you have a budget to build anything if you don't know what the final design is? This is not new. I did this again when we looked at U.S. shipbuilding. And if you look at the most recent report out on U.S. shipbuilding in the United States, the Navy, the carriers, the subs, the frigates, you name it, everything is late, everything is delayed because you're changing the plan. The frigate, the Constellation class frigate, was built on an Italian Frem class frigate. The idea was we're going to take the Italian design, build it in the United States at Fincantieri Yard, which is Italian, up in Wisconsin, because, you know, when I think of Wisconsin, I think Italians. They're going to build that up there. It was going to be 85% the base design. We're just going to change 15%. Now it's flipped. Now 15% will remain and 85% is changed. That is crazy, because you bought the design on the basis of having an off-the-shelf design so that you can build it fast. Now we're not going to get a frigate until 2030. It's 2024. It's going to be 6 years till you see this frigate. This is the craziness that is U.S. shipbuilding. And it's not cost. It's not, again, if you look at how they build ships in China, Japan, and Korea, they don't start building a ship till you give them the plan. And then once you give them the plan, that's it. No change. No, it's going to stay the same. You're going to get what you pay for. If you want to have change, great. You change them down the line. You don't change what's being built. This is the craziness that is going on with shipbuilding right now. And it's not a surprise then when you see it. It's one of the reasons why Japan, South Korea, and China are where they are in shipbuilding right now. Also helps that they give them a lot of money and government breaks and subsidies and indirect subsidies to get them where they are. And the U.S. doesn't do much for that at all in many ways. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope it got you caught up on what's going on with shipping and what the ship is happening. Because, man, there's a lot of ship happening out there. If you enjoyed today's episode, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit that super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly, yearly subscriber. Until our next episode of What's Going On Ship, and more importantly, our next episode of What the Ship, which will be much sooner than the last episode, this is Sal, signing off.